You're already wealthy in another timeline. Right now, as you're watching this, there's a version of you living in a completely different financial reality. That version of you made different choices at key moments in your life. They said yes when you said no. They took the risk when you played it safe. They invested when you hesitated. And because of those different choices, they're living in a parallel timeline where they're financially abundant, successful, and wealthy. This isn't science fiction. This is quantum physics applied to your money, and understanding this will completely shift how you approach building wealth. Here's what quantum physics tells us. Every time you make a choice, reality splits into parallel timelines. In one timeline, you made choice A. In another, you made choice B. Both timelines exist simultaneously. Both versions of you are real. And this applies to every financial decision you've ever made. Every time you chose fear over faith, comfort over growth, safety over risk, you created a split. One version of you went left, another went right, and now they're living completely different financial realities. Think about a major financial decision you made in the past. Maybe you didn't start that business. Maybe you didn't invest in that opportunity. Maybe you didn't ask for that raise. In this timeline, you made one choice. But in a parallel timeline, you made the opposite choice. And that version of you is living out the consequences of that different decision. They're experiencing a completely different financial reality than you are right now. This isn't just theoretical. Quantum mechanics has proven that particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed. The same principle applies to your life, your choices, and your wealth. You exist in multiple financial timelines simultaneously. The version of you that's struggling exists. The version of you that's thriving exists. The version of you that's wealthy beyond measure exists. They're all real. They're all happening right now. The only question is, which timeline are you tuned into? Most people go through life completely unaware of this. They think they're on one fixed path, one predetermined trajectory. They look at their current financial situation and think, this is just how it is. But that's not true. Your current timeline is just one of infinite possibilities. At any moment, you can shift your awareness, shift your choices, shift your energy, and literally move into a different timeline where a wealthier version of you already exists. This is what I call reality shifting for wealth. It's not about creating something from nothing. It's about aligning yourself with the timeline where you're already wealthy. That version of you already made the right decisions. They already took the actions. They already embody the energy of abundance. Your job isn't to become that person from scratch. Your job is to merge with that timeline, to collapse the quantum wave function in favor of the reality where you're already successful. The concept might sound abstract, but it explains so much about why traditional wealth advice fails most people. You're told to work harder, save more, invest wisely. But those strategies assume you're building wealth from zero in a linear progression. What if you're not building at all? What if you're simply tuning into a frequency where the wealth already exists? This changes everything about how you approach money. It's not about accumulation. It's about alignment. It's not about becoming. It's about choosing. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. You've probably already experienced glimpses of other timelines without realizing it. Those moments when everything flows effortlessly, when money shows up unexpectedly, when opportunities align perfectly, those aren't lucky breaks. Those are moments when you temporarily shifted into a more abundant timeline. The problem is most people don't know how they got there, so they can't stay there. They slip back into their default timeline because they don't understand the mechanics of what just happened. The moment of the split. Let's go deeper into how these parallel wealth timelines are created. Every single day, you're making dozens of choices that create timeline splits. Some are small, barely noticeable. Others are massive, life-altering. But each one sends a version of you down a different path. The key is understanding that these splits aren't random. They're created by your choices, which are driven by your energy, beliefs, and frequency. Here's a concrete example. Imagine you have an opportunity to invest $10,000 in something that feels risky but potentially lucrative. In this timeline, fear wins. You say no. You play it safe. You keep your money in savings. That $10,000 stays exactly where it is, maybe earning minimal interest. 5 years later, you're still at roughly the same financial level, and you wonder why nothing ever changes. But in a parallel timeline, courage wins. That version of you feels the fear and does it anyway. They invest the $10,000. Maybe it fails spectacularly, but they learn invaluable lessons that lead to their next successful venture. Or maybe it succeeds beyond expectations, multiplying into 100,000, 500,000, changing their entire financial trajectory. That version of you is now living in a completely different reality because of one choice at one moment in time. Now multiply that by every financial decision you've made in your life. Every time you negotiated your salary, every time you priced your services, every time you decided whether to invest in yourself, every time you chose between scarcity and abundance thinking. Each of these created a split. Each of these sent different versions of you into different timelines. Some of those timelines are slightly different from this one. Others are radically different. The wealthy version of you exists in a timeline where they consistently chose growth over comfort, courage over fear, investment over hoarding, abundance over scarcity. They're not lucky. They're not more talented. They simply made different choices at critical moments, and those choices compounded over time, creating a completely different financial reality. And here's the mind-bending part. That timeline is just as real as this one. That version of you is just as alive, just as present, just as now as you are. This means your wealth isn't something you need to create from scratch. It already exists in a parallel timeline. You don't need to figure out how to become wealthy. You need to figure out how to align with the timeline where you already are wealthy. This is a completely different paradigm for approaching money, and it changes everything about how you take action. What's even more powerful is understanding that these timeline splits are happening constantly, not just in major life decisions, but in micro moments throughout your day. When you choose to spend or save. When you choose to speak up or stay silent about your value. When you choose to take a break or push through exhaustion. Each tiny choice is creating a split, sending one version of you down a slightly different path. Over time, these micro-splits compound into massively different realities. This is why two people can start at the same place, with the same resources, and end up in completely different financial situations 10 years later. It's not just about one big decision. It's about thousands of small choices made from different frequencies. One person consistently chooses from abundance consciousness, the other from scarcity consciousness. Those different frequencies create different choices, which create different timeline splits, which compound into entirely different financial realities. The wealthy timeline isn't built in one moment. It's built in 10,000 small moments of aligned choice. Why you're stuck in this timeline? So if there's a parallel timeline where you're already wealthy, why are you experiencing this one instead? Why are you stuck in the timeline where you're struggling, surviving, or plateaued, instead of the timeline where you're thriving? The answer lies in your dominant frequency, your habitual choices, and your energetic alignment. Think of timelines like radio stations. They're all broadcasting simultaneously. Wealthy you is on 105.5 FM. Struggling you is on 88.3 FM. The version you experience depends entirely on what frequency you're tuned to. And what determines your frequency? Your thoughts, emotions, beliefs, actions, and energy in every single moment. If you're consistently operating from fear, scarcity, doubt, and limitation, you're tuned to the timeline where those states create your reality. Here's what's happening. Every time you make a choice from fear, you're reinforcing your alignment with the timeline where fear-based decisions lead to struggle. Every time you think, I can't afford that, you're tuning into the timeline where you can't afford it. Every time you choose comfort over growth, you're solidifying your position in the timeline where comfort equals stagnation. Your habitual patterns are literally keeping you locked into this specific timeline. This is why people stay stuck at the same income level for years or decades. It's not that they're not working hard. It's not that opportunities aren't available. It's that they're making the same frequency of choices over and over again, which keeps them aligned with the same timeline. They wake up in the same timeline, make choices from the same energy, and go to bed in the same timeline. Nothing changes because they're not doing anything different enough to shift timelines. The wealthy version of you in that parallel timeline isn't just making different financial choices. They're operating from a fundamentally different energy. They think differently. They feel differently. They believe differently. They act differently. Their entire frequency is calibrated to wealth, success, and abundance. And because of that calibration, they naturally make choices that align them with wealthy outcomes. They're not trying to be wealthy. They are wealthy. It's their default state. Meanwhile, you're in this timeline making choices from your current state, which is probably some combination of fear, doubt, unworthiness, and scarcity. And those states can only create more of themselves. You can't make abundant choices from a scarcity frequency. You can't access the wealthy timeline while vibrating at the struggling frequency. This is why mindset work and strategy alone don't create lasting change. You're still operating from the same core frequency, so you stay in the same timeline. The good news? Timelines aren't fixed. You're not trapped. At any moment, you can begin making different choices, choices that align you with a different frequency, which tunes you into a different timeline. But it requires radical honesty about what frequency you're actually operating from right now. Here's another layer that most people miss. You're not just tuned into one timeline. You're actually flickering between multiple timelines throughout the day. In the morning, after meditation or a good night's sleep, you might be vibrating at a higher frequency, briefly accessing a more abundant timeline. You feel optimistic, capable, wealthy in your energy. But then something triggers you, a bill, a rejection, a comparison to someone else, and you drop into a lower frequency, flickering back to a struggling timeline. Most people experience this flickering unconsciously. They don't realize they're jumping between timelines multiple times a day based on their emotional state and focus. The key to permanent timeline shifting is to stabilize in the wealthy timeline long enough that it becomes your new default. This happens through consistent frequency management, catching yourself when you drop into scarcity thinking, fear, or doubt, and consciously choosing to return to the abundant frequency. The more you practice this, the more stable you become in the wealthy timeline, until eventually, it's where you live permanently. How to shift into the wealthy timeline. So how do you actually shift from the timeline where you're struggling to the timeline where you're wealthy? It starts with a fundamental understanding. You don't create the wealthy timeline. It already exists. You align with it. You tune into it. You make the choices that the wealthy version of you is already making in that parallel reality. The first step is to get incredibly clear on who you are in that wealthy timeline. Not just what you have, but who you are. How do you think? How do you feel? How do you show up? What choices do you make? What do you believe about yourself and money? What energy do you operate from? The wealthy version of you has a completely different identity than your current self. You need to intimately know that identity so you can begin embodying it now. This isn't visualization or pretending. This is recognizing that the wealthy you is real. They exist right now in a parallel timeline, and you're going to start making the same choices they're making. When you're faced with a decision, you ask yourself, what would the wealthy version of me choose here? And then you choose that, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it contradicts your current circumstances. Here's a critical insight. The wealthy timeline isn't accessed through big dramatic changes. It's accessed through small, consistent choices that are aligned with a different frequency. Every time you choose courage over fear, abundance over scarcity, investment over hoarding, growth over comfort, you're shifting your frequency. And as your frequency shifts, your timeline shifts. It's not instant. It's gradual. But it's real. Think of it like steering a ship. A 1-degree change in direction doesn't look like much in the moment. But maintained over time, That 1-degree shift takes you to a completely different destination. Every choice that's aligned with the wealthy timeline is a 1-degree shift. Do it consistently enough, and you'll wake up one day and realize you're in a completely different financial reality. The second step is to stop reinforcing your alignment with the struggling timeline. Every time you complain about money, every time you make decisions from fear, every time you say, "I can't afford it," every time you play small, you're tuning back into the timeline where those patterns create your reality. You have to become militantly aware of these patterns and consciously choose different responses. This means changing your language, changing your thoughts, changing your emotional responses, changing your automatic behaviors. It's not about toxic positivity or denying reality. It's about recognizing that your current reality is just one timeline, and you're choosing to align with a different one. So you stop feeding energy into this one and start feeding energy into that one. The third step is to take actions that only make sense in the wealthy timeline. This is where most people get stuck. They want the wealthy timeline, but they keep taking actions that are aligned with the struggling timeline. If you're trying to shift into a timeline where you're a millionaire, you can't keep making minimum wage choices. You have to start making millionaire choices now, before the money shows up. Living in the wealthy timeline. Here's what happens when you successfully shift into the wealthy timeline. Reality reorganizes around you. Opportunities that were invisible suddenly become obvious. People who can help you mysteriously appear. Resources show up exactly when you need them. Synchronicities multiply. Money flows more easily. Things that used to be hard become effortless. This isn't magic. This is what happens when you're aligned with a different timeline. But here's the challenge. Your old timeline will try to pull you back. Old patterns will resurface. Familiar fears will emerge. People from your old reality might resist your shift because it threatens their sense of stability. This is normal. You're moving between timelines, and there's always resistance at the transition point. The key is to keep choosing the wealthy timeline even when the evidence isn't there yet. This is where faith comes in. Not religious faith, but quantum faith. The understanding that the timeline you're aligning with is just as real as the one you're leaving, even if you can't see it yet. The wealthy version of you exists. They're making certain choices, holding certain energy, living a certain way. And every time you make those same choices, hold that same energy, live that same way, you're collapsing the distance between timelines. You're merging with that version of yourself. Eventually, you reach a tipping point where you've shifted so completely that your external reality starts to match your internal frequency. The money shows up. The opportunities manifest. The success becomes visible. But here's what's important to understand. The money is confirmation that you've shifted timelines. It's not what creates the shift. You create the shift first through your energy, choices, and alignment. The money is just evidence that the shift has occurred. And once you're established in the new timeline, you have to make a commitment to stay there. This means continuing to make wealthy timeline choices even when it would be easier to slip back. It means maintaining the frequency even when challenges arise. It means remembering that you've already done the work of shifting, and now your job is to stabilize in this new reality. Here's the profound truth. You have access to infinite parallel timelines. Infinite versions of you living infinite financial realities. The poorest version exists. The wealthiest version exists. Every variation in between exists. And at any moment, through your choices and your frequency, you decide which one you're going to experience. This isn't about manifestation in the traditional sense. This is about timeline selection. You're not creating wealth. You're choosing the timeline where you're already wealthy. So the question isn't, how do I become wealthy? The question is, which version of me am I going to align with? The struggling version or the thriving version? The fearful version or the courageous version? The small version or the abundant version? They all exist right now. They're all real. They're all available. You just have to choose which timeline you want to live in and make every choice from that frequency. That's how you shift realities. That's how you access the parallel timeline where you're already wealthy. And that timeline is waiting for you right now.